Have you ever had that situation where whatever you do, the camera just seems like it just doesn't want to focus? Even if you've got all the correct autofocus settings and there's nothing in between you in the way, for some reason you just can't get the camera to focus and you can't figure out why. Well, there's a few specific situations why that might be the case. I'm going to help you to identify those and give you some ideas to work around it. Two very common situations where the autofocus can struggle are low contrast subjects and low light. So the low contrast subjects, this is where the bird or the animal doesn't have too much contrast. There isn't much variety in the coat or the plumage, for example. So if you looked at a roe deer, then it's largely the same colour, same tone. Also at both ends of the spectrum, this is definitely going to be the case. If you're photographing a bird that's very, very white, then that can be an issue. Or if you're photographing a bird that's completely black, that can make the autofocus struggle as well. So I would say that pretty much all cameras focus much better when there's more contrast, because it's kind of giving the focus more to lock onto. So if you're photographing a subject that's got more patterns, variety of colours in there, then it's going to be a bit easier for the camera to focus. Low light is exactly that. Once the light levels start to fall, cameras love lots of light for autofocus. So in bright conditions, your autofocus is going to be more responsive and work better. If you're shooting at either end of the day where the sun's around the horizon, or if you're shooting on a day like today, which is really cloudy and quite dark, then you will find your autofocus generally is going to become more sluggish and not as fast. So if you're having these problems, there's a couple of things that you can do. And the first one is to make a special effort to focus on the eye. So try and get that focus point directly over the eye as much as you can. Now, if the subject is quite far away, it's not going to make too much difference. And also if you've got like a black head with a black eye, like a carrion crow, for example, it's not really going to make a difference there. But with a lot of birds and animals, you should find a little bit more contrast around the eye. So just try and get that focus point as accurate as you can. And then the second one is, if nothing's working, if you tried everything and it's just not locking on to the head, then this is a little trick that I've tried in the past and it has worked. Instead of focusing on the head or the eye, try and focus literally on the edge of the head. So you're basically aiming for the outline, that outline edge. And the reason that can help is, again, I think it's just more contrast. So it's where the subject is against the background, that edge gives a bit more contrast, and I think at times it can help the autofocus to lock on. So it might sound a bit weird, that one, but if you haven't tried it, give it a try. And another thing you can do is to use the center focus point, which brings me nicely on to the next issue, and this is to do with off-center focusing. Now, a lot of people will use the center focus point in their wildlife photography quite a lot of the time, but you can also use different focus points. So you could use a top focus point, maybe one to the side. The reason for doing that, there's two reasons really. The first is that you just might want to compose the bird or the animal slightly to one side of the frame, and it works nicely for that. The second is that it just kind of aids general composition. If you use a focus point that is naturally where the head is, then that just sometimes helps the composition and balance of the image. So there's nothing wrong with using those focus points. It's a useful tool. The problem can be that they're just not as responsive as the center focus point. So sometimes, even in favourable conditions, you might find you're using a focus point that isn't on the centre, because that's what you want to do. But again, you have trouble, it just won't lock on, it keeps hunting and it won't focus. So in that situation, what I'd advise is you go to the center focus point and use that one instead. It's almost certainly going to be much more responsive and faster. So in terms of composing your image, if you want to recompose with that method, then you basically need to lock the focus in some way. You could either do it with back button focus, in which case you would focus using a AFC. You'd focus with your thumb on the button, you get it focused, you take your thumb off, you would move the camera to recompose, and then you'd fire the shutter. Or you kind of do the opposite. If you're using like a one-shot AFS, for example, you're just going to use the shutter button to focus and fire. So you'd get your focus point on the head, half press the shutter to lock it, move the camera to recompose, and then fire the shutter. Either way is absolutely fine, but basically what you're doing is locking the focus with a center focus point, and then you're recomposing before taking the picture. The next situation where you can have focus issues is where you're photographing silhouettes. So for example, maybe it's a mammal against a skyline, or maybe it's a bird in flight. One of the main problems here is that sometimes, because you're photographing into the light, sometimes you may be photographing almost kind of towards the sun, and what can happen is the rays of sun can actually come into the lens and they can really cause havoc with the autofocus. So if you're photographing very directly or almost directly to the sun, be aware of that, because it can really cause problems. The other issue is if you're using one single focus point. So if the silhouette's quite big and you're just using that small focus point, then again it's a little bit like the low contrast subject. It's a bit like photographing something completely black. There's not as much for the camera to kind of grab hold of, so you may have a problem with the focus hunting there as well. In that case, I would suggest that you switch to more focus points. So expand the area, the focus zone, use more focus points, and I think that will just help to kind of pick up the overall shape and outline and help to lock it into focus. The next thing to mention is weird plumage, and I know you're probably thinking, what is he talking about? This is something I've found with certain birds. It's a bit strange, but sometimes their plumage just doesn't look sharp. So I've noticed this with a few birds in particular, and I've looked at the images afterwards on the computer, and I'm thinking that it just looks a little bit soft. It's the best way to describe it. It just looks soft, and I can't identify why. And I've just found it seems to be the case. Tell me if I'm wrong. If you think I'm imagining it, it's fine, but if you agree, please let me know in the comments box. There's a few subjects which I've noticed, and particularly with owls. So little owls, long-eared owls, tawny owls, and I've noticed it a bit with young peregrine falcons as well, that there's parts of their plumage, and sometimes around kind of the breast area, where it doesn't look as sharp. And it's literally just the way it is. It's just how that plumage looks. So if you find that situation where everything else looks sharp, but that bit for some reason just looks slightly soft, then it might just be that's just the way it naturally looks. If you're a bit unsure and it's frustrating you, then look at the eye, look at the head. If you can see the feet, look at the feet. And if all of that looks pin sharp, then there's really no reason that area shouldn't be sharp as well. You don't have to do anything or make any adjustment, but just be aware of it. I'm going to put a video up on the screen of how to photograph birds in flight. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.